The fog over the marsh place always sat lowest where the water pooled, a gray shawl draped across 60 acres of black belt bottomland that hadn't grown a full stand of anything since the spring of the big flood. The clay out there wasn't ordinary clay. It was pale, almost bone-white in patches where the topsoil had washed thin, and it squeaked underfoot instead of sucking like normal Alabama dirt. Nobody in Perry County thought much about that anymore. They'd stopped thinking about the marsh place at all, except as the cautionary tale you told a grandchild about land that ate money instead of making it. Owen Marsh was 34 years old the day he stood at the edge of that fog with a field notebook open against his forearm, sketching the slope of a ditch nobody had asked him to sketch. He'd been a civil engineer for 11 years, the kind who kept every job site notebook he'd ever filled in a milk crate in his truck bed, because his grandfather had taught him that a habit unwritten was a habit forgotten. His grandfather had also been the last Marsh to farm this exact ground, before the water started winning every March like clockwork, and the family finally let it go. Owen's grandfather used to say the marsh place had 2 seasons, wet and about to be wet again. As a boy, Owen had watched the old man walk the fence line every February, with a level tucked under one arm, checking a slope that never seemed to drain the way it should, muttering that the land owed the family an explanation it never gave. When the old man's knees finally gave out, and the taxes came due 2 years running, there was no explanation left to wait for. The family voted, mostly out of exhaustion, to let it go, rather than keep bleeding money into ground that flooded every spring like it was being punished for something. His uncle Gareth Combs had been the one to sign the papers. $4,200, cash, for 60 acres, that had been in the family since before the Depression. Gareth hadn't apologized for it at the reunion last summer, and he wasn't apologizing now, standing at his truck door with his arms crossed while Owen picked his way across the wet field. "You're wasting a Saturday," Gareth called out. "That ground's been drowning longer than you've been alive." Gareth had his own version of events, the one he'd told at every reunion since, that he'd tried 3 buyers before the one who finally took it off his hands, that he'd have paid someone to haul the deed away if it meant no more calls from the county about drainage liens. In his telling, selling the marsh place wasn't a betrayal of the family name. It was the only sensible thing anybody had done with that ground in 40 years. Owen had heard the story enough times that he could have narrated it himself, word for word, without feeling a thing. Today, watching Gareth's boots sink an inch into pale, squeaking mud, he felt something anyway. Owen didn't argue. He'd come out for a firm's flood mitigation study, nothing personal, a favor for the new owner, who wanted to know if the property could ever be reclaimed. But the notebook in his hand had started filling with something other than culvert measurements. Every 20 yards, the standing water traced the same crescent shape, curling around an old fence line, like it was following something buried, instead of just settling into a low spot. He worked a probe rod along the crescent for 2 hours, marking each strike with a wooden stake, the way his grandfather used to mark fence post holes before a big job. The rod kept hitting something hard and hollow sounding about 3 feet down, always along that same curving line, never anywhere else in the field. By early afternoon he had his answer, or thought he did. Buried under 18 inches of silt near the fence line sat the collapsed mouth of a clay drainage tile, part of a reclamation system laid down back in the 1930s and abandoned when the money ran out. The tile had crushed under decades of tractor traffic, and every spring since, the water that should have run off toward Cold Branch had nowhere to go but back into the field. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't bad soil. It was one collapsed pipe, 11 feet of clay tubing, and nobody left alive who remembered it was there. He almost laughed out loud. 60 acres, a family legacy, $4,200, undone by something a backhoe could fix in an afternoon. He called the new owner that evening with something like relief in his voice, promising a full report and a modest repair estimate by the end of the week. If a story like this pulls you in, The kind where an ordinary field turns out to be hiding something nobody bothered to ask about. Stick around, because the ditch wasn't the only thing Owen found buried out there, and it wasn't the only question this land was about to reopen. He went back out that Thursday to confirm the tile's full run before writing his estimate, and that's when the second thing happened. Clearing silt from the collapsed section, his shovel caught on something that wasn't clay pipe and wasn't fieldstone. It was rock, but rock the color of chalk, layered in ribbons so fine and so white it looked poured rather than deposited. He'd seen outcrops like it before. In a geology elective he'd nearly failed in college, part of the old Selma chalk formation that ran under a wide belt of West Alabama, laid down when this whole stretch of the state had been an inland sea. Most of the formation was buried too deep or too broken up to matter to anyone. This seam wasn't. It ran wide, unbroken, and close enough to the surface that a single collapsed tile pipe had been holding back both water and a small fortune's worth of pure agricultural and industrial-grade limestone chalk, the kind processing plants paid real money to quarry when a deposit was clean enough. Owen sat back on his heels in the mud for a long moment, notebook forgotten, doing math he didn't want to be doing. He called a geologist he'd worked alongside on a highway cut survey 2 counties over and described the seam over the phone. The thickness, the unbroken run of it, the way it caught light like something almost polished. She went quiet, then let out a low whistle. Deposits this pure usually sat 40 or 50 feet down in this part of the Black Belt, she told him, if they turned up in workable thickness at all. A seam this close to the surface, this wide and this clean, was the kind of find that had quarry operators driving in from 3 states over just to look. The land Gareth had sold for $4,200 didn't just drain into a fixable ditch. It sat on top of something worth more, by a conservative estimate, than every other piece of ground the extended family had managed to hold on to out of stubborn pride, combined. He thought the story ended there, a bitter little irony he'd carry quietly and never mention at Christmas. Then his phone rang. It was the new owner's lawyer, asking a question Owen hadn't considered. When a mineral deposit is discovered on land sold without a mineral rights clause specified in the original deed, who actually owns what's underneath it? The man who sold the surface for scrap value, or the man who bought it not knowing what he was buying? Owen drove back out to the marsh place one more time before giving his final report, this time at dusk, when the chalk in the exposed cut caught the last orange light and glowed like something lit from inside. Gareth was already there, arms crossed at the same fence line, having heard secondhand what the survey crew had found. He didn't look smug this time. He looked like a man doing arithmetic on land he no longer owned. "You knew the ground never really failed us," Owen said. "It just needed one pipe fixed. And it was never worthless. It was only ever waiting." Gareth didn't answer right away. When he did, it wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a defense. It was quieter than either. "I didn't sell dirt," he said. "I sold what I thought it was worth to a man who'd already stopped believing in it." Then he turned and walked back to his truck, leaving Owen alone with the notebook, the chalk, and 60 acres that had spent decades being underestimated by everyone who ever stood at its edge, including, for 11 years, the engineer who finally knelt down and looked closer. The lawyers are still working out the mineral rights question as of this telling, and Owen still hasn't decided whether he'll tell his uncle the final appraised number when it comes in, or let him keep guessing.